McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Marijuana is being legalized in many states, though the federal government still considers it a Schedule I drug. Some of our friends think that legalization is a good idea. Some of our friends say marijuana is dangerous and should be tightly controlled. On this program, you're going to hear from those who are leading the way to legalization and from those who see the downside on using this substance. But before we meet our experts, I'm honored to introduce my co-host. Katy Carol Whitton is an award-winning print, radio, and television journalist who had her own television program in Colorado, and that's particularly interesting, Stephen. We're talking about marijuana here, so welcome to the program,
Thank
Katy.
you so much. Very apropos. I didn't plan it that way.
I got it.
Now I'd like to get started by introducing one of our guests. We have here David Vanderveeren. David is a licensed professional counselor and the founder of Sea Change. He's also, and Sea Change is here in Carrollton, Texas.
Carrollton, Texas, yes.
Okay, very good. And you have a master's degree in professional counseling
Yes.
and a bachelor's degree in both psychology and Christian ministries from Dallas Baptist University.
Yes.
And most importantly, David is an addiction survivor of 24 years. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here, David. And joining us
Good to be here.
Joining us via Skype is Mason Tvert. He's Media Relations Director for the Marijuana Policy Project and has worked on several state advocacy campaigns, including the successful 2012 initiative campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol in Colorado. Mason is the co-author of the book, Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? And he's been called Colorado's top thinker in politics and government by the Denver Post. So, Mason, welcome to the program. So tell our viewers what the Marijuana Policy Project is, and then give us what you think the benefits are of the legalization process so far.
Sure, thank you for having me. The Marijuana Policy Project is the nation's largest organization dedicated to reforming our nation's marijuana laws and replacing our failed prohibition policies with more sensible ones that regulate marijuana and treat it more like alcohol and ensure that it's available for those who could benefit from it for medical purposes. MPP has been largely responsible for a lot of the state marijuana laws that have passed around the country over the last couple decades. And ultimately, prohibition has failed. And our goal is to have more sensible laws that are laws that people will respect. The majority of Americans think marijuana should be legal, about 66% now. And, you're seeing marijuana entirely uncontrolled. It is being sold illegally on the streets, and what we want to do is tightly control it. We want to make sure that it's being sold by licensed producers and retailers, and that it's being taxed, and that we know who they're selling to, so that we can ensure people are staying safe and that we're keeping it out of the hands of kids.
Okay, thank you, Mason. We'll be back to you shortly. Katy?
David, you just heard Mason talk about marijuana and being pro for the legalization, but you have a very personal story. If you're willing to share it with us, I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. Right before I do that, I would like to just kind of comment on one of the things that Mason said. It's a common myth that marijuana is safer than alcohol. They're basing that result on acute toxicity mortality rates. Okay, we don't know the long-term effects of is marijuana going to be safer than alcohol. Those studies haven't been done. So that information is relevant, I think, to know, for everyone to know.
Do we even know if it's addictive?
Oh, yes. 1 in 10 people will become addicted to marijuana, and disturbingly, that number goes up to 6 in 10 when they start using before the age of 18.
Wow. So tell us about your story.
Yes. So I started using at 12 years old, and the first thing I did try was marijuana, and came from a broken home and had some other situations, but I ended up finding substances, if you would. And I suffer from the disease of addiction. And it's important for people to understand there's a difference between addiction and dependence. Addiction, the chronic progressive brain condition, if you would, and dependence, meaning someone might go through a situation in their life where they're using a substance very heavily, but then they're able to let that go and move on with life.
Is addiction something they can scan in your brain, actually see? I know they've identified an addiction or an alcoholism gene.
Right, right. Well, that's actually a myth. There's not an alcoholism gene as opposed to a marijuana gene, so on and so forth. It's the gene, if you would, of addiction. And there's two chemicals. With the advent of MRIs and PET scans, we understand now that there's two chemicals working differently, dopamine and glutamate. And the most basic example I can give you of that is in the non-addicted brain, someone who has a glass of alcohol will relax. They socialize, they wind down. The addicted brain has a glass of alcohol and it energizes, it goes in a different direction. So we can see that happening. So we have chemical things happening differently in the brain of someone who does suffer from addiction.
Okay.
All right, Mason, I want to clarify one thing with you. Mason, would it be fair to say that you guys are not advocating that underage youth prevent, I should say, try to prevent them, you're trying to prevent them from using marijuana. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. I mean, let's be clear here. Both sides of this argument, we want to prevent young people from getting access to marijuana. But what we're seeing is that for the last several decades, the vast majority of young people have said it's easy to get marijuana, despite it being illegal. So we're really, as a country, arresting and punishing hundreds of thousands of adults to keep it out of the hands of teens, and teens say they can get it more easily than adults. What we want to do is control it and make sure that it's difficult for teens to access and that they have to show ID like they would with alcohol.
All right, good. I appreciate that. Now, just to be clear, that's where he's coming from too. However, you said you started at 12, wow. And what is the impact, medically, the impact on a young brain of 12 or even 16 or 18 or obviously younger than 12? What is that impact?
Well, we know that specifically marijuana hijacks the process in the hippocampus, okay, and that handles reasoning, emotions, so on and so forth. When someone begins to use a drug at a time when the brain is busy formulating, if you would, trying to figure out the structure of operating, and we introduce a chemical, that can have long-term effects in the brain. So this is where much of the research right now is focused on. In most of the studies now, we see that people who use marijuana, say, after the age of 25, aren't experiencing some of these short and long-term effects, if you would.
I want to get back to more about the health risks, but I wanted to hear a little bit more of your story. How did you get clean and sober? It's been almost 25 years.
It was a long journey, and so my journey through addiction delayed my attainment of education. I mean, it stalled my life, if you would, until I got that part of it under control. And I had trouble with mood regulation and all of the things that we see now in the research. I was, if you would, a living kind of longitudinal study of what marijuana will do over the course of a lifetime when someone starts at a young age. So at 30 years old, I came to a crossroads in my life where it's like the pictures were flashing before my eyes. I could go in the same direction, or I could make a decision and try and do something differently. And my journey started in the rooms of AA, and my faith ended up being a primary part of what happened to me in the end. And I came, and eventually, I mean, I think about my potential sometimes. I went back in my 40s and did my bachelor's and did my master's, but I struggled. I struggled with the things we see in the effects of marijuana. I struggled in the area of retaining information, long-term memory, so on and so forth, the cognitive aspects of it. I was someone who had to really kind of focus to keep information in my mind before testing and so on and so forth. So I literally watched this happen as I was learning about the research and how, again, drugs, alcohol, those things affect the brain.
But you finally got sober.
I made it.
You made it.
I made it.
So Mason, there are millions of addicts like David, but unfortunately many of them do not get clean and sober. Have the opponents' fears come true? People who oppose the legalization of marijuana, have they come true?
No, what we're really seeing is that the laws here in Colorado and some of the other states that have passed them are working quite well. And we've even seen elected officials who were initially opposed to these laws coming around and acknowledging that the sky didn't fall, and they're actually really working out. I mean, you've not seen any sort of increase in teen use here in Colorado or any of the states that have made marijuana legal for adults. We've not really seen any sort of significant new problems. Basically, marijuana is something that's been widely available for years. Anyone who wanted it could get their hands on it. It's just that now we're actually controlling it, and millions of dollars in sales are taking place in licensed businesses instead of out on the street.
Well, Mason, isn't the potency that's available today a lot stronger than it was 30 years ago?
Well, there was high potency marijuana before, and there's high potency marijuana now. Ultimately, it's like saying, well, isn't there whiskey available now when there was beer years ago? The fact of the matter is marijuana is actually less harmful and less addictive, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, than both whiskey and beer. So I would take issue with what the other guest said about marijuana being more harmful than alcohol. It is actually less addictive, less toxic, less likely to contribute to violence and other sorts of problems. And these products are out there. It's a question of, are we putting our heads in the sand and ignoring them, or are we controlling them, making sure they're labeled so people know what they are, how potent they are? I mean, imagine going to a liquor store and just seeing clear bottles full of liquid without any labels whatsoever to know, is it whiskey or is it beer? Okay. In Colorado, we now have labels on those products to make sure people do know what they're getting.
Okay. David, I thought you had another point about the CDC saying that it's...
Well, yes. I'd like to point out right now that just yesterday, Fox News Denver reported on an Associated Press article. A Denver hospital study has just recently been done, and we have those results in from 2014 to 2016. They saw a 3-fold increase in emergency room visits for marijuana intoxication, if you would. You can look at that article, Mason. What the talking points that they have is that this is safe, it's safer than alcohol, so on and so forth. People will be, it'll be, when it's easier to get, then we won't have the crime, so on and so forth. First of all, the cartels aren't going to close up their business and start selling snow cones because we legalize marijuana. That's still going to be a part of it. The other thing is, marijuana is the most common narcotic found in the blood of people in fatal crashes. The most common. The problem is how we record that statistic is if they have alcohol in their bloodstream, it's contributed to alcohol rather than marijuana. So the other thing is the fatal crashes. We know now fatal crashes have doubled in Colorado. I don't know what, Mason talks about it's safe, we have no problem, right, so on and so forth. No, there's concern. And people at the top of this debate, the researchers, what they're saying is, we need more time. The policy is way ahead of the research on this. We need more time to look at things as they go. And that's not happening. By the way, Mason does not work for the marijuana policy project in Colorado. He's not an employee of that organization. He's an advocate for softening the views of legalized marijuana. That's what he does. So he's going to kind of refute everything and again push the lighter side of having marijuana in our society. And I'm against that right now. I am for medical marijuana, absolutely. And I am for decriminalizing, absolutely. Okay. But to release this narcotic into our society until, before we've actually had a chance to find out, the true effects of what it's going to do to us, I think is irresponsible.
Okay. Would you be open to it if there was enough research?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
So it's not that you're no marijuana,
oh,
no
no,
time.
Not at all, not at all. I would also point out that Andrew Friedman, who is the director of the marijuana coordination in Colorado, on a panel, at Harvard panel discussion, said to everyone there, we need more time. The federal government has not put their research weight behind marijuana in Colorado, so they're doing this on their own. They're scrambling. The marijuana lobby wants it to happen fast because it's a business. We haven't had time to catch up with what's really going to happen with this in our society. And so I say proceed with caution. That's where I'm at. And one of the researchers made a great point. We can use the medical marijuana study to gain our statistics about what's going to happen to us physically, emotionally. So people are going to have, or the medical marijuana is going to help people. At the same time, we can do our research on how marijuana affects us through that. But the policy is way ahead of the research right now, and that's what concerns me.
Okay, let's talk to Mason. Mason, you've heard a lot of different things that he said there, so talk about, if you will, this idea of all the marijuana in people's brains or in their bloodstream, as it may be, if they have these accidents, and also checking into the hospital, 3 times as many people suffering from some sort of overdose of medical or non-medical marijuana.
Yeah, the other gentleman really just made so many claims that were off base that it's hard to get at all of them. Number one, traffic fatalities have not doubled in Colorado. I would encourage everyone to look into that. In fact, we've seen traffic fatalities increase nationwide, and according to research published by the American Journal of Public Health, they did not increase any more in Colorado or in Washington than in other states that didn't legalize marijuana. So when Andrew Friedman, who's no longer with the governor's office, in fact, what he does now is help other states with setting up these legal marijuana systems, because he is one of those people who saw that this can work, and he's been helping states make it work. And what he was referring to is that we were not, as a state, collecting enough data about marijuana before. So he was saying, don't make before and after comparisons on legalization. You need to look at the baseline and then look at the future. And he was simply warning people against making the exact kind of claims the other guest just made. Ultimately, regulation is working. I mean, if we've had this experiment of prohibition going on for decades and decades, and I'm hearing this, well, we need to slow down. We've taken 80 years of hundreds of thousands of people a year being arrested for marijuana possession when they're not committing any other crimes, not hurting anybody. We're treating people like criminals for using a substance that's less harmful by any objective measure than a cocktail.
Okay,
and we need to start treating this substance more realistically and acknowledging it's out there and controlling it rather than burying our heads in the sand and just leaving it to the black market.
Okay, but you would agree, Mason, that we are light on research because the legalization in Washington and Colorado and other states has been fairly new as things go, and that the federal government, instead of doing research as is done often on, quote, drugs, because they have criminalized this thing, has actually caused all the research that would have been done on cannabis not to be done. Isn't that true?
Well, you're right that there's a problem when it comes to a lack of research, but the research that there's a lack of is research surrounding the benefits of marijuana and legalization, because the federal government has not allowed that type of research to occur. They've allowed plenty of research into the harms of marijuana, and generally what those researchers have concluded is that marijuana's harms do not warrant its criminal status. So, marijuana is one of the most studied substances out there. It's just that we've only been looking for problems and generally finding that it's not as problematic as people have been led to believe. And now we're finally starting to see research into its benefits and finding all the things that it's doing for people with various medical conditions where it can be beneficial, and basically finding that there is an alternative to prohibition, and it's regulation and control like we do with alcohol.
Okay, so perhaps we're also talking about the distinction between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. What do you think, David, are some of the health risks of recreational marijuana?
Well, we know smoking marijuana can cause impaired judgment, short-term memory problems. It can cause acute anxiety episodes. In some cases, it causes psychosis. We know now that people who are genetically vulnerable to the condition of schizophrenia, meaning they have a variance in one particular gene that causes schizophrenia, are 10 times as likely to develop that in their lifetime through the exposure to THC.
Could that just be self-medicating?
Absolutely. People are self-medicating. That's part of how people get started. Absolutely.
Okay.
And many people have co-occurring, who come in for addiction treatment, have co-occurring issues going on. Absolutely.
Okay, so you're not saying because they smoke marijuana, they're schizophrenic. You're saying
no.
They are schizophrenic and they're trying to treat
Well, actually,
their,
no. This
okay.
study linked the use of marijuana to people who are vulnerable, who have that gene variability in their profile, to being more susceptible to it developing in their lifetime.
Well, and that's you're talking about several studies. This is one, and Mason, you can comment on this if you like. This was in the Lancet published. Smoking high-potency marijuana daily nearly quintuples the risk of psychosis. That's one thing. The American survey, of course, it shows everybody wants marijuana legalized. Not everybody, but obviously more Democrats and Republicans, even the majority of Republicans want it done. And so, and then, of course, Mason, there's Alex Berenson's book, Tell Your Children, which everybody says is a bad thing, but on the other hand, he's pretty straightforward about it. What do you have to say about that?
Well, ultimately, when it comes to the Lancet study, it's really important to note that they did not make a causal link between marijuana use and psychosis. In fact, they don't even explain how they determined the potency. They just say, based on people self-reporting the potency of the marijuana they used, they determined high potency was linked to this. But ultimately, what we've seen is that over the last several decades, there have been dramatic changes in rates of marijuana use, but we've not seen any changes in rates of these mental health conditions. And if they were in fact so causally linked, there would be. And that's why there are also so many studies out there that say marijuana does not cause schizophrenia or mental health conditions. It can, as the other guest mentioned, exacerbate them in people who already have these conditions. And that's why we want to have education out there and have labels on these products that warn people, if you have an underlying mental health condition, you should be warned not to use these, as opposed to just keeping people in the dark. And Alex Berenson's book has basically brought reefer madness back and has been widely panned by newspapers and by writers and researchers all over the country for how utterly ridiculous it is in making these wild claims that marijuana leads to people becoming murderers. It's the kind of craziness we used to hear in the 30s that we've moved beyond as a country. We need to have a real discussion about the real harms of marijuana, which are, it can be a problem for people with mental health problems. It could increase your heart rate if you have an existing heart problem. You should know that. It probably should not be used by women who are pregnant. They should talk to their doctors and shouldn't just use it without consulting a physician. There are lots of potential problems associated with marijuana. They're not going to be solved by keeping it in the underground market and just pretending it doesn't exist. They'll be solved by education and regulation and making sure people know about this product.
Okay, thank you, Mason. I appreciate that. Before you ask him that other question that I know you have, I'm going to mention to that viewer that there is a program on YouTube called The Weed Show, which is hosted by a lady named Charlo Green, Charlo Green. And so all of you in weed may want to look at that. I looked at one of them, and she had 2 pregnant women on there talking about the benefits of marijuana to being pregnant. You've got a better question, so go ahead.
Yeah, but I thought we would change to the more financial aspect of this. I lived in Colorado, Mason, when marijuana was legalized, and one of the big promises were the tax revenues that would be generated. Colorado was going to solve a lot of its problems because of the sale of marijuana. Has that come to fruition?
Well, yeah, Colorado's generated almost $1 billion in tax revenue from marijuana sales since it made marijuana legal for adults. It's put hundreds of millions of dollars towards our schools, towards school construction, towards bullying prevention, dropout prevention, substance abuse treatment, addressing homelessness. All these things, different localities are using local tax revenue for things like paving roads, for any number of things. Now, no one ever promised that the tax revenue was going to solve all problems. In fact, all we said was this will generate as much as $40 million per year for public education for schools. And it's actually generating far more than that because the legislature added additional taxes after the voters approved it. So, you know, by any account, the tax side of this is working, and the amount the state is bringing in far, far exceeds the amount it's spending on regulation.
Mason, has it been used for public education?
Oh, hundreds of millions of dollars have gone toward the state's public school construction fund. They've gone towards hiring school nurses and grant programs for school health professionals. As I mentioned, bullying prevention programs, dropout prevention programs, and so on. And that's why the Department of Education here in the state actually puts together a fact sheet detailing where all those millions of dollars have gone.
So I hear all those benefits, but I didn't hear health education about marijuana use.
Well, that's exactly what it's funding. There's been more education on marijuana in Colorado over the last 4 years than in this entire country in the last 50. If you look around, you'll see pamphlets, you'll see billboards, you'll see TV ads, you'll see campaigns targeting young people. In fact, the state just put out a report highlighting that its program on education has been working, that they've done surveys of teens in Denver that show that they're seeing these messages, that they're agreeing with these messages, and that fewer of them are choosing to use marijuana as a result. And that's why teen marijuana use in Colorado has not increased. And the state is touting that fact and attributing it to all the education that's going on.
Well, we certainly hope, Mason, that that is the case and that they spend some of those good tax dollars educating people. We just have about 30 seconds left. David, go ahead and give us your last thoughts, and then I'll ask Katie to wrap it up.
Sure. The thought that we're going to solve our societal problems by adding another narcotic to it is kind of disturbing to me. I think we're a higher thinking people than that. We can solve our problems in another way. We have enough problems with alcohol and other things that's destroying families, and you know, and it's really a cancer on our society. And so I hope we do the research. I hope medically we can use it, and I hope we decriminalize it, get everyone out of jail. But I hope we don't turn it loose.
Thank you so much, David. As always, you've heard good arguments on both sides, and we don't tell you what to do. Having said that, we do hope that you'll be careful and act responsibly. We especially implore you not to expose young people to marijuana for recreational purposes because of the recognized effect it has on young developing brains. Check out McCuistionTV.com for another recent program we did on marijuana. And please follow us on Twitter and let us know your thoughts about this program. Thanks for inviting us to talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.